Could Canon's answer to the Sony's a7S III be 2 cameras? Let's talk about it. Hey, welcome, Magnus here, and if you're new to my channel, I like to talk about cameras, tips and tricks, as well as talking about camera news and all that other stuff. I gotta come up with a really closed down together intro because I keep on just switching it up. But in other words, I always talk about the same things, which is cameras and what you can do with them in purposes of video. So if you're new here, definitely consider subscribing and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on my current videos. Now, if you're not new to my channel, you'll notice that I kind of changed the set around a little bit, and that's in honor of fixing up this studio a little bit more and getting my 5D Mark IV back. I've had that camera for repair for a long time now, and because it's now back, it's actually the yellow square right behind me. I'm really excited to be able to use that again, especially since I haven't had it in like a month. And that's a story for another time. But let's get to the main point of this video. Canon rumors reports, okay, and take these rumors with a grain of salt. They're not really kind of like the really super confirmed rumors. But from what they're hearing, there's going to be 2 new R5-ish cameras announced. One is going to be like an R5C, and one is going to be like an R5, like R or something like that, like a high resolution version of the R5. And let me talk you through some of the specs. I've got them right next to me over here. It says that the R5, the video version, like the R5C, is going to have like less than 12 megapixel sensor, but it'll be able to give you 4K 120 frames per second, and you can also do 2.8K of oversampled footage using the middle of the sensor, like APS-C sized sensor. So that's on the video side. And then the high resolution version of the R5 will be what's rumored to be 80 megapixels. Though the video features of that camera were not speculated. And it's also rumored that they're going to have new heat sinks built into those cameras, so there won't be an overheating issue. But let's talk about not so much the high resolution camera that's rumored, but let's talk about the R5C, what they're calling it. Is it really necessary? It's like taking the R5, stripping out the high resolution, and just giving you the 4K that you want. And probably, I would imagine that they would like up the bit rates and up the quality of the sharpness as much as possible. Pretty much make it HQ everything, even though it can't downsample from an 8K sensor because that sensor is going to be roughly like a little bit less than 12 megapixels. But you can downsample from that less than 12 megapixels down to 4K and still have a pretty sharp image. And then you don't have to worry as much about overheating. And then you put in the R5's image stabilization, color science, and all the features. And I think, and maybe even add a bit more features, like out of the box, it should have C-Log 3, C-Log 2. It would be interesting too, as well, if they also put Canon RAW in there. That would be an advantage over Sony's because it'll do internal RAW recording. Put that in a camera and make it a good competitive price for video, and I think that this could possibly be Canon's answer to Sony's a7S III to take your attention away from a7S III after it robbed the R5 of its attention because it could do 4K 120 frames per second with no overheating, or very difficult to overheat the a7S III, whereas the R5 not so much. It gives you limits and it lets you know, hey, I'm about to overheat, stop recording. So granted, Canon's actually gotten a lot better with firmware updates, but we're still kind of like, man, it would have been nice if it could do this without the worry of overheating. I know when I'm on a shoot, I don't want to worry about overheating, but then when I actually got to test the R5 a couple of weeks ago, which I already posted the video for, it never overheat on me. So my concerns and my worries about the overheating crisis, especially with the firmware updates that Canon has put out, has pretty much diminished. I'm not worried about overheating at all with the R5. But even less, I mean, take off those timers with the R5C, and you're pretty much set with a great camera that's going to give you crisp video features that you can trust. Now, because these rumors are not really credible at this point, we have to give some time before anything more is known. It could be a cinema-centric camera instead of like a mirrorless camera. So it could be, all right, they're putting out a new camera on their C line, their cinema series, and then they'll charge you like $6,000 or $8,000 for it, which is the unfortunate part. We want the mirrorless cameras to have these next level video features because cinema cameras just, especially when it comes to like Canon's line in particular, although, I mean, Red, Arri cameras, forget about affording those. But even when it comes to Canon's not so expensive, but still pretty pricey cinema cameras, they're thousands of dollars. I'll give you one example. The closest thing that we got to a DSLR mirrorless camera that was actually had great cinema quality features was the 1DC released years ago. It was the first DSLR-like camera body that can record 4K. And it recorded cinema 4K at 24 frames per second. And that cinema 4K was with the dreaded MJPEG codec, so it wasn't great. But it did have C-Log. You were able to get 4K, which no other camera was offering. But it was released years ago with a price tag of $15,000. $15,000. It was a full-frame camera, but the 4K was still cropped a bit. But it was $15,000. I guess 4K was still next level when it came to back then, but it was just not at a price point with the features that serious cinematographers wanted to use, nor would photographers or those that like hybrid cameras wanted to buy into that camera. So that price tag was like immediately almost dropped instantly. And when you look today, I mean, the 5D Mark IV is still the latest DSLR in the 5D series. Everyone says R5 replaced it. I do believe the R5 is a mirrorless replacement of the 5D, but the 5D is the last DSLR in the 5 series. And that camera still uses MJPEG, but that camera does it up to 30 frames per second. And that camera can do much more different versatile things with that body at a much, much reduced price. It wasn't $15,000. Granted, it was years later, and competition was already releasing 4K capable cameras at reasonable bit rates, great quality, and reasonable prices as well. So releasing like a mirrorless body, calling it a cinema camera, giving it all these features, and then charging a crazy amount of money for it doesn't make much sense at all. It makes more sense to actually release it with a reasonable price. You could still call it cinema, but a cinema affordable priced camera with 4K 120 frames per second, Canon RAW potentially, and C-Log 3 maybe, that would be an incredible feat, and it would be smart of Canon to release it at a reasonable price, because if you release it way too expensive, you already have competition from Sony that has a camera that's more affordable. It wouldn't make much sense to buy it, of course, unless you have more cinema features, buttons, and connections, because a lot of these cinema cameras make it easier for a videographer to have what they need, like internal ND filters and different settings that you can have with different recording modes inside the camera to make it easier to record, and ports galore so that you can connect them to video systems. That's what you would need if you're releasing a cinema camera. But if it's a mirrorless body with mirrorless body connections and you're going to overprice it, then it's definitely not worth it. Now, to wrap it up, the high-resolution version of the R5, so let's call it like the R5R, for example, that makes sense to me because Canon, after they released the 5D Mark IV, they've released the 5DS and the 5DSR. Those cameras were extremely high megapixel versions of the cameras, like 50 megapixels in a full-frame sensor. And that's pretty high. That's a very high megapixel count, though Sony has higher megapixel count in some of their cameras. It's still great to have it in a Canon camera. So to release a replacement for those cameras in the R series would be a great camera to own for photographers specifically. Now, no video features are speculated, but one would assume that maybe at least you'd get 1080p at like 60 frames per second, which was what was included off of those older cameras, because downsampling like 80 megapixels for a 4K image and really pushing that internal processor would probably overheat that camera to death. So it doesn't make much sense, but to do like a 1080p video signal would still look nice, and at least it's still something to have. Last but not least, I want to talk about, would I cancel my pre-order for one of these cameras, like a high megapixel R5 or the video-centric version of the R5, the R5S, right? And my answer to that is no. I'd still choose the R5 over both of those cameras, because R5 is at that perfect midpoint where I can take great high-resolution photos. 45 megapixels is still pretty good, and take great video up to 8K RAW, 4K 120 frames per second. Maybe they'll add in 1080p 120 frames per second or more in a future firmware update. But right now, even if they didn't, as is, it's still a very capable camera. Two modes of 4K that's oversampled from 8K, or one that isn't, but you still have those options without having to worry about overheating at all. And Canon's color science and just the familiar body with incredible photo features, with the eye autofocus, pet animal detect autofocus. It's just all those features in one camera body. If I got the low resolution Canon camera that sure doesn't give me overheating, but it does do the video modes, well then I'm missing the photo specific features that I want in one body. And since the R5 is so good at it, I used it, it's so good at taking photos, I wouldn't want to sacrifice that just to get like 4K 120 frames per second. And 4K 120 frames per second would probably be used not often with me. I have the ability to shoot 1080 120 frames per second, or 1080 at 180 frames per second with the GH5. And with autofocus, I can shoot up to 120 frames per second audio and autofocus on the Samsung NX1. And it's rare. I think I want to shoot more high frame rates. Definitely even with the Blackmagic that I'm using now, because to have high frame rates and to really get some good like slow-mo and setup things would be really nice. I filmed a quick little 60 frames per second 1080p shot of slow-mo with the 5D Mark IV as soon as I got it in, just because I wanted to just use it and test it to make sure that it's working completely. It's like for those like high-res slow motion modes, it's still good to have it, but it's not something that I'm going to use consistently all the time, not for my shoots. And since I usually do like stage presentations and like dance recitals, slow motion is not something that we use as far as what the parents are looking for. Parents are looking for the dance routines and film. So that's consistent recording, but since I use more than one camera, even the 30-minute time limit doesn't bother me at all. I actually stop the camera between routines anyway, so that the file sizes are not that big. Even having a 30-minute time limit doesn't affect me for long recordings. Right now, R5 is literally the limitless perfect camera. And to top it off, what do you guys think of these rumored cameras? Do any of them interest you? Would you actually cancel a pre-order of the R5 just to get a no overheating video-centric R5 with less megapixels, or a double resolution 80 megapixel R5 just to take those landscape photos that you might want, or those high-res photos that are really come in handy? Let me know in the comments down below, and let me know what you think of this set, whether you like this format better. I know it takes a little bit to get used to before it's this format, or if I stick to the old format. I'm still kind of deciding, and I want to see how it looks after the edit. But as always, you guys are incredible. Your comments mean so much to me. I mean, I read every single one of these comments, and I really not only want to get to know you guys by talking to you with the cameras, but sometimes you guys help me. And also, if you do have a channel and you want me to check it out, let me know. And I will definitely, if I like your content, definitely subscribe. Only subscribe to me if you like me and if you like my content, definitely. If you want me to tackle or address something, also let me know, and I'll see if I can make a video or two about it. But I want one of my next videos to be, I've got a couple of videos in the pipeline. I've got a few more tests with the R5 because I've got all the footage and all the stuff that I shot off the R5. I want to really dig deeper into the files and what I was able to do with the R5 and working with that footage, and then show you guys. And then a long, funny story about the servicing drama of my 5D Mark IV ending in, believe it or not, a actual physical altercation that involved police getting involved over this 5D. You will not believe it's a crazy story. I can't believe it. And special thanks to Canon for actually finally fixing my camera, but it's one heck of a story. So you guys will definitely look out for that video coming soon. It might be next. I don't know. We'll see what happens. And as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys next time.